So, sacrificial atonement is what we're talking about. Let's just move on through that question I've just given you. So, some of the answers, or some of the responses that we've come up with. Vampires are essentially dead. Thank you, Jenny. Vampires drink
Mm.
blood. Thank you, Gay. Vampires can't enter hallowed ground and can be repelled by holding up a cross. So this is what I was about to get onto. One of the fascinating things about this mythology is that there are lots of hideous mythological creatures. Werewolves are another one that fairly skin crawly. But
Mm.
vampires are the only ones where this is a big part of the mythology surrounding them, that they can't be allowed onto hallowed ground and that you can get rid of them by something as simple as holding up a cross. There are reasons for that, and we're going to be coming to that a little later. So let's think of those same points in a little bit more detail. Vampires are dead, and somehow the blood that they drink gives them life. They don't only drink blood, but they take blood from living creatures, and they use that to conquer the death that is inside them. And this act is so abhorrent that they can't come near anything representing God. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that we believe in vampires, nor am I pretending that they're anything other than hideous ideas. But the reason I'm bringing them up at the moment is that the story seeds that grew into vampire mythology are also in the Bible and are also in a number of other cultures.
Mm.
In the vampire mythology, they grew into stories of horror. In the Bible, they grew into stories of life and grace. So it's amazing that these same little gems of ideas could develop in two such different ways.
Mm.
But at the same time, they do have some things in common. And bizarrely, keeping an idea of this vampire thing in the background can actually help us understand what's going on when we get to the Bible. Because the main thing they have in common is that both the vampire mythology and the Bible believe that blood is life. And, as you can with an awful lot of these slightly weird things in the Bible, you can take it a whole lot of ways. You can think that when they talk about blood being life, they're being metaphorical. You could say that the blood is kind of carrying life in the bloodstream, or you can just say blood is life and work at it from there. And to some extent, that's what the Bible itself does. So Leviticus 17 is one example of it. If any one of the house of Israel or of the aliens who reside among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood and will cut that person off from the people. Why? For the life of the flesh is in the blood. Its blood is its life. So that's a kind of central idea that runs all the way through the Bible. And of course, life itself is a gift from God. Life itself is something which is holy. So we have to treat blood very carefully. Right at the beginning, in the first three chapters of Genesis, it seems that we were designed to be vegetarians. So thumbs up to anyone here who is a vegetarian, because we're told that God gave us every seed and every seed-bearing plant for our food and for the food of all the animals in the world. However, what happens in the first 8 chapters of Genesis is that humanity becomes more and more vicious and kills each other and boasts about the number of murders that they do. And after the flood, God clearly now compromises. And so now he says, every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, right? Just as I gave you the green plants originally, now I give you everything. But there's one condition here. You shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning from every animal as well. So why? To us, it feels so weird to think that's fine. We're allowed to eat a cow as long as we don't eat its blood. But actually, it's a really, really important idea, because what this teaching is saying is that, yes, if you have to eat to sustain yourself, that's fine. But you're not going to take something else's life for yourself, right? The life is something which is holy, and the life continues to belong to God, and so therefore has to be treated with reverence. So, for example, if someone is killing an animal to eat it, they drain out the blood and then they bury the blood as, with respect under dirt, showing that this is not mine. I'm not making any claim on the life of another. We might come back to that a little bit later, because this is actually an idea which has been taken up by a lot of modern philosophers about the way humanity kind of almost eats each other. And this is saying, no, there's a limit. So just to kind of sum it up, blood is life. It is holy and belongs to God. And then the third thing, remember, God will set his face against the person who eats blood, or cut that person off from the people. What we find through the Old Testament is that if you take blood the wrong way, or if you desecrate it, then it continues to be powerful, but its power turns dark. What used to be the power of life now becomes, in some ways, a kind of warped life, or the power of death. Although this is the group that I know has read very little Harry Potter and not much Narnia either, I'd still like us to have a look at these two illustrations that we've got in this little book. So those of you who've got the Lent study book,
Yep.
If you turn to page 13, I'm going to get someone to read the Harry Potter one and the Narnia one. Just the background for the Harry one, if you don't know anything about the Harry Potter series, Voldemort is the figure of evil. And before the series starts, he's managed to fragment his soul so badly by murdering so many people that by the time the book starts, he's really just a kind of wraith and hardly any life at all. But of course, he is wanting to get back into power. I mean, this is one scene, obviously, that I chose because I'm trying to stick to these two series. It is an idea that comes back repeatedly in literature and in mythology. So here you've got someone who is seizing life from another, and from a pure, innocent unicorn, which is often, the symbol of Jesus. So is seizing life from another. And yes, he's getting life, but because he seized it unwillingly, or from someone who's given it unwillingly, that becomes a cursed life. The Narnia one is a completely different angle on the same thing. This is from the silver chair. So this is the other side. So here, Aslan is giving his blood, his life, willingly. And in that case, this lifeblood is able to conquer death, right? So there's the two sides. There's the two sides of this power of blood. And in case we think, as we tend to, that this is all very weird in Old Testament and it was all kind of overturned by the coming of Jesus and not something we need to worry about anymore. But we don't get off scot-free, because remember how in the book of Acts, all these Gentile churches were beginning to be formed, and the community in Jerusalem were working out, well, then what do we have to ask these Gentile churches to do? We can't expect them to be circumcised. We can't expect them to follow all 614 laws. What are we going to focus on? And here's what they say. Therefore, I've reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, and from fornication, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. So in other words, they thought there were only really 4 prohibitions that were so important that even the Gentile churches needed to follow them. Right? We know all about idols. We know all about avoiding fornication. But animals that are strangled couldn't be eaten because it meant their blood hadn't been drained out, and you'd be eating the blood. So 2 of the 4 prohibitions for the early church were all about how important it was not to drink blood. So it's just something we need to keep in mind. I'm not saying we need to immediately go and get kosher meat, but it's worth understanding why it's so important for Jewish and Muslim people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so blood is life, blood is holy. Shedding it violently turns its power of life and holiness into the power of death and desecration. So, what we get happening in the Old Testament is that if someone is murdered, right, or even just accidentally killed, and their blood spills onto the ground itself is desecrated. It brings death to the ground itself. And then this idea is kind of expanded, I guess, so that anything which is anti-life, against holiness, desecrates and pollutes the ground, the land of Israel. Now, this is a hard thing for us to get our heads around, because when we think of things that we need to repent of, things that we might, if we're in Old Testament times, might have had to take a sacrifice to the temple about, we tend to think of things that we deliberately did wrong, that affected us. Now, the Jewish understanding of sin is far more like an oil spill. And in an oil spill, if I make a mistake, which means that oil spills out into the sea, of course, at some stage, I need to be taken to task. But actually, the most pressing issue is cleaning up the oil. Okay. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So, yeah. So the pressing issue for the Jewish people was, how do we stop this oil spreading out so that our entire land is polluted? Because if our whole land is polluted, God can't dwell there. God will leave.
Mm-hmm.
And it even says at one point that the land will vomit out its inhabitants if it gets that polluted. So this, the effect of things we do, whether they were deliberate or accidental, that we do against God, against life, affects everyone, not just ourselves. And that's a really interesting and important, I think, way of understanding sin. So they're in a bit of a pickle, and God gives them a way through. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever managed to read all the chapters in the book of Exodus about the building of the tabernacle.
Yep.
A
Yep.
lot of
Yeah.
some people have. Congratulations if you have. A lot of people who start gamely to read all the way through the Bible get stuck at these chapters. And then, of course, we get building the temple later. But people who have really dug into these chapters at great depth for a very long time and know a lot more about it than I do, have come up with some fascinating understandings of the tabernacle. And the central one is that the tabernacle was built to represent the world in miniature. So it's kind of built like the first 7 days of creation. And just as a kind of sideline, interesting little thing, the 7 days of creation in some ways are also structured like a temple. And the very last thing you do in an ancient temple is put the image of God, the model of God, in the temple. And of course, the very last thing God does in the 7 days is create humanity to be God's image in the world.
Mm.
It's just an interesting little thing. Anyway, so they kind of reflect each other. So this tabernacle, if you want to drag in another bit of horrible mythology, the idea of making little wax figures of people and sticking pins in them, and somehow the person themselves is injured.
Mm.
So in a way, that's kind of what the tabernacle is designed to be. You could also think of it more mundanely as a magnet. It's designed to kind of suck in all the pollution of the land and gather it together in one place. Another amazing illustration, I read Jacob Milgrom, who wrote fabulous commentary on Leviticus. He talks about the temple in the same way as the portrait of Dorian Gray. Has anyone read or seen that? Yeah. I seem to be giving you all these horrible stories. Anyway,
Mm.
Dorian Gray is one of these kind of macabre stories about a young man who's very wild, are very, very beautiful, has a portrait painted of him, and makes a kind of, I suppose, the equivalent of a pact with the devil, that he is going to be able to live his life any way he wants to, as debauched as he wants. And I think he murders someone at some point, and he will continue to look young and beautiful, but the painting will get warped more and more from what he does. And then at one point, he pulls back the curtain he's put over the painting, sees how unbelievably hideous it is, and is so horrified that he stabs the painting, and in so doing kills himself. So, not a very happy little story. But again, this is what is happening to the temple. Whatever happens in the ground around the outside, it's the temple itself that gets polluted. So what do we do with the temple? Because we've managed to gather all the muck from the entire country into one place, but it's still got to get dealt with there. Right? Because the Holy of Holies, God's dwelling place, is there. So when you've got a pile of death and desecration and unholiness gathered together in one place, what are you going to use to conquer it? What conquers death?
Blood.
Life, okay? And that we have life in physical form in blood. So this is another thing we have to change our mindset about. When we think of the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, we must be careful that we don't think of it the same way as Roman sacrificial system, which was trying to appease an angry God, trying to get an angry God to be on side. For the Jewish people, the sacrificial system is a gift from God so that they have a way of cleaning up the mess of their temple. Right? So if I know that I have been unclean in some way or done something against life, against God, I will bring something like a goat along, lay my hand on its head so that I move my identity into that goat. And then the life of that goat, the blood of that goat, is used to clean up the temple. It's sprinkled around the temple, some blood is put on the horns of the altar. The idea being that this is life, which is soaking up whatever death I've contributed. Okay? So not a punishment. It is a means of cleaning up. Okay? Everyone got that?
Yep.
Right. So that's all very well. But this blood was really used to clean up things that were accidental or repented of, things that, we did, which were in some levels kind of mild sin. But if we did stuff which was seriously rebellious, seriously bad, it polluted the Holy of Holies. And the blood of a goat that is just kind of my ordinary human life wasn't strong enough to clean that up, which is how we get to the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. On the Day of Atonement, rather than a human being laying their hand on a goat, 2 goats are brought before God, and God chooses one. The other is then used as the scapegoat, which is another whole story. We can come back to it another time. But the one that is kind of has God's hand laid on it, then becomes God's representative. And then the priest, who has the name of God on his forehead, takes this goat into the Holy of Holies and uses that blood to soak up the deepest, darkest sins, which our own lives could never have touched. So the picture we've got is God coming into the darkest, most death-imbued part of the temple and giving God's blood in order to clean up the mess that is there. Is this beginning to ring some bells now? We've been a bit of a long way getting there, but what's this got to do with Jesus? Absolutely everything. It's all the stuff we talked about last week about needing to know the background story. If we come to this with the story of a Greek sacrificial system, we talk about Jesus as a sacrifice, we're going to think that Jesus appeased the anger of God, right? If we come with the Jewish sacrificial system, as our background story, we have a very different understanding of what the New Testament writers said. Every year, the Hebrew people celebrated Yom Kippur, and every year, for a time, the Holy of Holies was pure, the people were reconciled to God, sin was wiped out. Every year it was effective, but it was just partial, just local, and it had to be repeated time and time again. So for the early Christians, they saw what happened when God's self, came and gave his own real blood, not the representative blood of a goat, but God's actual blood. And when I first realized this, it was amazing to think, what would the power of that blood be if it held God's life, the power of God's life? We had never had anything of material form of that power before. And this blood cleanses not just the local temple, but the world, and doesn't do it just once, but does it forever. So every time we celebrate the Eucharist, one of the sections in the Great Thanksgiving prayer, we proclaim Christ's one-time sacrifice for the sins of the world. And this is precisely what we're talking about here. And then the whole lot of other beautiful little things that we can spin off from this. They're part of the questions that would normally follow that we'll look at. But I want to put here in the recording as well. One is, when Jesus came to earth, remember that he said that he was now the temple. Do you remember that bit? When he says, tear down this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. And in John's gospel it says, but he was talking about the temple of his body. And that makes sense, because if you look at Jesus's life, he was like a mobile temple. Everywhere he went, he did what the temple was there for. He brought forgiveness, he brought cleansing, he brought reconciliation, he brought life. Right? So Jesus was a kind of mobile temple. Again, in John's gospel, when it says that Jesus came and dwelt amongst us, the word is actually tabernacled amongst us. So Jesus was the tabernacle moving around. But after Jesus' death and resurrection, and where did the temple go? Who was the temple? What was the temple? It's us. We're the temple, okay? We're the temple both individually. Do you not know that your body is where the Spirit dwells? So we are individually, in some sense, the temple, but we are also the bricks being put together to build the temple. And I find that a beautiful, beautiful image for who we should be and who our church should be. We should be places where people come for healing, for reconciliation, and for life. And one more little image. If our body is the temple, then every time we share communion, we take the blood of Jesus into the temple of our bodies in order to cleanse everything inside us. And again, I found that transformed my experience of communion when I began to realize what that picture is. One last thing, just because it's quite a heavy thing, this, and I rather enjoy this last one. I hated the Cat in the Hat as a kid. I always got panicky over when they'd get it cleaned up in time. Your mess is so big and so deep and so tall, you cannot pick it up. There is no way at all. Don't worry, I got it. Jesus.